Have you ever felt?
Are you listening? Damn.
Hello out there on YouTube. This is Lance with Fly Fish Food. I want to show you my very favorite go-to imitation, or GTI Caddis. This is a Czech style nymph. It's really popular for Euro style nymphing, or Czech nymphing, as you may have heard it called. It's a fly that I use often as an anchor fly, as my heavier fly, which I usually fish on the top of my rig. Heavier fly on top, lighter fly on the point. And anyhow, this is one of my favorite patterns. It's a color combination I have a lot of confidence in, and I hope after you tie it and fish it, you will too. So let's get started. I've got a Hannock 300 hook in the vise. This is a size 12. I've got a 3.3 millimeter tungsten bead. You can vary the bead size and of course the hook size to your liking based on what kind of insect or what size of insect you want to imitate, and also just to the weight that you need to help get your rig down to the bottom. I usually carry these in 2 or 3 bead sizes in the same hook. So in a size 12 like this, I might sometimes do them with a 2.8 or a 3 millimeter bead, and the 3.3 would be my most common size. And then you could fish it up to a 3.5 or even a 4 millimeter bead if you wanted to make them really heavy. Anyhow, first thing I'm going to do is add some lead wire. So some 015 lead wire. If you want to make it really heavy, you could do 020. If you want to make it lighter, you could do some 010. Put a little bit of lead wire on here. I'm going to put quite a bit of it actually. Coat maybe half the shank with lead, right up until I get to the bead. Then I'm going to push the lead wire up into the bead, which makes it so it migrates down and up the shank a bit. Really push on that a bit, and then I'll break off the excess lead wire. So now I've got it pinched nice and flat there with my fingernail. Next I'm going to start the thread. The thread I'm using is UTC 70 denier in olive. I'm going to start it right behind the lead wire and wrap it, creating a ramp so that I'm forcing the lead back towards the bead, and then once I build the ramp about the same diameter as the lead wire, I can then wrap up onto the lead wire and coat it with the thread to really lock it in place. Alright, now for this next part I like to move the fly in the vise a little bit, change the angle of it a bit if you will, just move it down. I'm going to migrate the thread down the shank a little bit, and I'm going to tie in the tail. So the tail for this fly is 2 peacock curls. So I've got 2 peacock curls here, the natural tips on the end. I'm going to get them so that the butts are lined up, and then I'm going to take them and actually pinch them about, maybe 1 inch from the tips and just break them off. By breaking them, you make them so that they have kind of a bit more natural taper to them. So if you cut them with your scissors, everything looks really, really blunt, if that makes sense. But by breaking them, you oftentimes get the stem that breaks, and the little feather barbules are still extending down. So I'm going to make a really short tail, okay? And I'm going to wrap over the peacock all the way up to where the lead terminates, okay? So when I get it right to the lead, right about there, I'm going to use some thread tension, pull tight on my bobbin, and I'm just going to pull those fibers off. You could cut them away, but it's quicker just to pull them away. Okay, that also makes a really clean tie-off point. Next up, I'm going to add my first ribbing number 1. Ribbing number 1 is some 6X tippet material. I'm going to lay it in and capture it with the thread, and then I'm going to just basically pull that down to where it's right, the monofilament starts being tied in right where the lead wire ends. So I'm going to kind of even up that part of the body. I'm going to wrap this monofilament right down to where I tied in the tail. Capture it with my material clip here. And now I'm going to add ribbing number 2. Ribbing number 2 is some olive crystal flash. I'm going to capture it also with the thread and try and tie it in right up near where the lead wire terminates again. Try and create a bit of that leveling body. Okay. Now I've got both my ribbings in, the tail in. Next up is the dubbing. I'm going to add some Hairtron dubbing from Hairline in the olive. This particular one is a fairly light olive. They call the color just regular olive, but it is in relation to other dubbings that are available. In relation to the thread, for instance, it's quite a bit lighter in color. very caddis green, if you will. Okay, so I'm going to wet my fingers because I have crazy dry skin. It makes dubbing much easier when you have a little bit of moisture on your finger. You could lick your fingers. However, if you read all your fly tying labels, it says that everything contains a chemical known to the state of California to cause cancer. That's usually lead. And since I wrap the body with lead, I figure I don't need to lose any extra brain cells and get cancer any earlier than I probably already will. So anyway, I like to use a little bit of moisture, just a little bit of water on my tying desk to help create this dubbing noodle. Okay, so now I've got a nice thin dubbing noodle, and I'm going to just cover the hook with this dubbing noodle. I want to keep it relatively thin, but I want to make sure it's also relatively even and well covered. So if anything, I'm going to taper it a bit as I move up. I had a little bump in the dubbing there, so I'm going to tighten that particular spot up a little. There we go, it looks a little bit better. I'm going to continue up. There, I ran out of dubbing, so I'm going to get just a little bit more and add it to the thread. There we go. A little bit more of this hairline olive hairtron. Okay, I'm going to try and create a little bit of a as relatively consistent thickness of a body as I can. Like that, right? Okay. Next up, I'm going to add some Arizona synthetic peacock dubbing. This is a pretty coarse dubbing. This is just the natural peacock color. Because it's coarse, again, the moisture helps stick it to the thread. And I don't need very much of it, just enough to go around a time or two. Okay, just going to make a little bit of a darker thorax, right? And basically it terminates almost right at the bead. Okay, all right. Next step, I'm going to take the olive crystal flash and I'm going to wrap it the opposite direction that I, the opposite direction that I wrap the dubbing. So this is going to lock the dubbing in place. Okay, so I'm just going to rib it like you would any regular nymph, just spacing wraps as I walk up the shank here. I'm going to get right to the bead and wrap around it with the thread to capture it and hold it in place. Then I'm going to trim the excess away. Okay. Next, I'm going to add the wing case material, which is hairline scud back in 1/8 inch in a color called Summer Duck. It's kind of a, I don't know what you want to call it, a burnt orange maybe color. This is a crazy color, but it works really, really well. And I'm going to take this 1/8 inch scud back and catch it right behind the bead. Maybe. There we go. Catch it right behind the bead. Okay. And lock it in place with a couple of high tension thread wraps. And then I'm going to throw a little whip finish in to hold the thread in place. Next, I'm going to grab hold of this monofilament in the back of the fly, and I'm going to give it half of a wrap so that it's now on my side of the vise. So when I stretch this scud back over the back of the fly, I'm ready and in position to capture the scud back with the monofilament. Okay, so I'm capturing it, and I'm going to wrap this monofilament the same direction I wrap the dubbing, which is counter wrapping the tinsel. I'm trying to basically make each of those wraps go over the top of where I had the tinsel wraps. So right at the top where I'm wrapping them over the scud back, I'm capturing the scud back in place with the monofilament. Okay, this is just to hold the scud back in place and also create a bit of segmentation. Then once I get to the bead, I'm going to tie the monofilament off and then get rid of the excess. Now I can come into this scud back here, stretch it just a little bit and give it a trim. It leaves a nice little tie-in point, or really a termination point at the back of the fly. Okay, the last step is to add just a tiny bit more of this Arizona synthetic peacock dubbing to the thread, just to cover up where I tied in that scud back and where I terminated the monofilament. So it doesn't take much of this, just a tiny bit to create a little bit of a head. I even usually wrap through it a couple times with my thread to really lock that dubbing in place. It kind of just hides in the dubbing. And then I'm going to whip finish behind the bead. Now this is basically more imitative pattern than most of my flies. Most of my flies I think you'd classify, or at least I would classify them as more of an attractor pattern, a general representation of something. This particular fly probably is a little more imitative in that it looks a lot like a free-living or caseless caddis. There's something about that summer duck back mixed with the olive body. I don't know what it is, but I know that I've played with lots of variations of this, and the more realistic I make them, when I tie these with black bead heads to match the black head of a caddis, and I tie them with a back material that's more imitative, maybe more of an olive color, a darker olive, I can build a fly that looks very, very similar, almost exactly like the actual insects that I find in the river. However, when I fish those flies, they don't tend to work as well as this particular color combo. So anyway, use that summer duck and that lighter olive. It's truly, like I say, just called olive, but it's a very light olive relative to most olive dubbings. Use that color combination, and for whatever reason, it works really, really well. The GTI Caddis. It's heavy, it gets down where the trout live, get it in their face, and let them do the rest of the work. Have fun.
Have you